Welcome and thank you for your interest in the East Central Regional Arts Council. My name is Katina. I'm the Grant Program Officer here at the Regional Arts Council. If you're unable to join us for one of our grant information sessions at our location in Hinckley, we hope this online workshop will help with some questions you may have about ECRAC and our grant programs. This grant information session is for individual artists located in our region. If you're an organization and you're interested in the grants we have available, please go to our grant info session for organizations. If you're an individual artist, you're in the right place. The information I'll be covering today includes the overview of the arts funding within the state of Minnesota and with the East Central Regional Arts Council, as well as the ECRAC programming and specifically grants for individual artists. Also, grant writing basics, and questions, of course, will be more difficult to cover because this is pre-recorded, but please don't hesitate to contact us if you have questions after you have completed the info session. The Minnesota Arts Funding System is a unique decentralized system of 11 regional arts councils. We disseminate state and other funding for local arts projects, artists, arts and education, arts organizations, and other local arts activities. We are partners with the Minnesota State Art Board, and we serve the nonprofits arts community. Our region is Region 7E, and we serve the counties of Chisago, Isanti, Kanabec, Mille Lacs, and Pine. The regional arts councils are funded through 3 funding sources: the McKnight Foundation, the State of Minnesota's General Fund, and the State of Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. You can see here the breakdown of what funding goes towards which art programs. The McKnight Foundation funds our individual artist grants, so the ECRAC Individual Artist Mid-Career Grant and the Essential Artist Award. Both are funded through the McKnight Foundation. The State of Minnesota's General Fund funds our Art in Our Schools grants, small art project grants, as well as the scholarship for K-12 students. The State of Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, or ACHF funds the organization art project grants as well as individual artist grants. On November 4th, 2008, voters approved a 25-year arts legacy for the state of Minnesota. The Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment was born. Minnesotans resoundingly passed the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment to the state's constitution, and as a result, over a 25-year period, 3/8 of 1% of the state sales tax are dedicated as follows: 1/3 or 33% to the Clean Water Fund, 1/3 or 33% to an Outdoor Heritage Fund, and the final 1/3 is broken into 2 parts: 14.25% to Parks and Trails and 19.75% to an Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. You can find out more at the website www.legacy.leg.mn. The 19.75% is where ECRAC Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund grants comes from. This 19.75 also funds other regional arts councils, as well as Minnesota Public Radio, libraries, historical societies, zoos, etc. If you go to the website, you can search by region and year to see what projects have been funded in the past. ECRAC is both an old and new organization. In July of 1979, the East Central Regional Arts Council became a program of the East Central Regional Development Commission in Mora. In 2010, after working with a consultant and with much input from constituents, the decision was made that the Arts Council would leave the RDC and become the new designated Regional Arts Council, an independent nonprofit, and on July 1st, 2011, they moved their offices to Bram, Minnesota. Now, in fiscal year 2020, on July 1st, ECRAC moved our new office to Hinckley, Minnesota. Please help us spread the word about the new location and the grants and services that we have available. The mission of the East Central Regional Arts Council is to support the arts and bring the life-enhancing values they afford to Region 7E residents. ECRAC accomplishes this mission through programs and special initiatives for artists and art organizations. In other words, our goal is to increase the arts. Our vision statement includes all Region 7E residents will have the opportunity to participate, appreciate, create, and invest in the arts. Our values are arts in action. We are motivated by our love of the arts to serve artists and organizations with resources, education, and commitment. We welcome all artists and organizations as partners in our common goal of developing a vibrant arts community. Integrity. We recognize all art forms and act with consistency, support, and respect in all our relationships and in our stewardship of the resources entrusted to us. Artistic merit. We uphold a high standard of artistic quality that promotes growth and development of creative knowledge, skills, and understanding. Legacy. We understand and appreciate that the arts are an essential part of our heritage and daily lives. We uphold the creative spirit from the past, in the present, and into the future. Please be aware that the mission, vision, and values of ECRAC play an important role in our grant programs. ECRAC provides grants to artists, arts and other nonprofit organizations, educational institutions, and local units of government. This is where we spend the majority of our time. But we also provide technical assistance, workshops, and referral services to arts organizations as well as artists, and we coordinate the Arts Regional Needs Assessment and the subsequent arts plan for the region. ECRAC board members include Marianne Cleary, Barrett Hint, Nancy Hoffman, Terry Sanford, Alana Peterson, Angela Ruddy, and Deanne Sibley. This is a local board with local decision-making authority. We do have vacancies, so if you're interested in being a board member, just let anyone in our office or one of the board members know. It is important to know who the board members are because you cannot lobby or try to encourage them to fund your grant project. It does make your application ineligible, and of course, we don't want that to happen. The ECRAC programming for individual artist project grants include the ECRAC Individual Artist Mid-Career Grant for $2,500. This grant has 2 grant deadlines, February 1st and April 1st. The Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund Grant for individuals is $1,000 and has 3 deadline dates, October 1st, February 1st, and April 1st. The Essential Artist Award is $8,000 and has 1 deadline on March 1st, and the Scholarship for K-12 students is for $500 and also has 1 deadline date of March 1st. In addition to the grants that we offer, we do also have additional services available. We have an Essential Arts e-newsletter. We also have an art gallery space where we usually have our permanent collection hanging, but we'll occasionally have art shows. We offer resource information. We offer also economic development information. We have an arts library available. We do have workshops and for artists and organizations, as well as grant information sessions, usually on a monthly basis. We offer grant writing technical assistance for artists who are applying for grants. If you have a draft of your application completed, you can request grant writing technical assistance where we would review your draft previous to submission. This service is very helpful to get feedback on your application before you submit it for review. We also offer art show display equipment for rentals, so if you're having an event for your project and you don't have display equipment, you can certainly reach out to us and see what equipment we may have available. We also have art shows such as the annual Image Art Show. We have space for meetings and art events. We have past approved grant application library, so if you're interested in reviewing past successful grants, you can come into our office and review some of those applications in our library. We do have remote office hours, so keep your eyes peeled on our website and newsletter for information about our remote office hours. We do have referrals and other services if needed. Do you really need or want to write a grant proposal? We hope you do. That's what we're here for and what we're passionate about, but it's not always the best fit. That said, ECRAC reviews about 100 grant applications annually and funds about 2/3 of them, so those odds are pretty good. Some things to keep in mind are that our grant programs are not free money. There is a lot of paperwork, including the final report and submitting all proofs of expenses after your project is completed. And then there is a possibility of public scrutiny. This especially for state-funded applications where the tax dollars are being used towards those funds. So those are some things to keep in mind before you begin your application. Okay, what are some of the new things that are going on here at the East Central Regional Arts Council? If you've applied with us before, you may have noticed previously in the slide where some of our grant amounts have changed. So the ECRAC Individual Artist Grant is now the ECRAC Individual Artist Mid-Career Grant and has increased from $1,000 to $2,500. The ECRAC Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund Grant for individual artists has decreased from $2,500 to $1,000. The Essential Artist Award increased this year from $7,000 to $8,000. ECRAC no longer allows presentations during the grant reviews. However, applicants are still encouraged to attend the grant review. ECRAC's remote office hours are available. Check out our website, ecrac.org, for updates on when and where these remote office hours will be. ECRAC's art gallery space is available to individual artists as well as organizations for meetings and art events. So if you are applying for an application that requires an open to the public event, you can reach out to ECRAC staff and we can work with you on how we can make that event work in our space if it works for your project. The grant guidelines and the grant review criteria have been updated. Work samples for organizations have now been added, so that's definitely new for organization grants. And then there has been revised budget templates. So those have been updated. If you've applied in the past, you'll see that they look a little different this year, but not much. One thing I do want applicants to understand or to realize that if you are applying for a grant and you're not funded the first time, we definitely encourage you to apply again. If your grant project isn't funded, it's not personal to your project, it most likely means that there might have been something missing from your application. If it was a required item and it wasn't included, a lot of times your project may have scored too low for funding. We do have limited resources to fund projects. The key is to not get discouraged if you're not approved. Always reach out to us to find out what the grant reviewers had to say about your application if you weren't able to come to the review, and definitely reapply. I do see many applicants who aren't funded reapply and get funded the second time they do apply. So I would encourage you to always reach out to us and talk about the grant project you have in mind. And definitely the grant technical assistance is helpful if we can review your draft of your application before you submit it. And give you some feedback. That doesn't always guarantee funding, but it certainly doesn't hurt. So just some additional things to keep in mind before you're starting your project. Other items to keep in mind as an individual artist before you apply is grant eligibility. Make sure that you are a permanent resident located within Region 7E for at least 6 months previous to the deadline date. If you're funded, you will be asked for your driver's license or other proof of residency. You must be sure you're applying as an individual artist and not for a collaboration or to benefit a group or organization. For example, if you're an individual artist applying to teach a class, an art project, that would not be eligible for the individual artist grants. We do want these individual artist grants to benefit you as an artist. You must be located within you must be a United States citizen or permanent resident alien status. You must be at least 18 years of age unless applying for a student scholarship, of course. If you're applying for McKnight funding, you are eligible for McKnight funding every other year. So if you receive McKnight funding in 2019, you'll need to wait until 2021 to reapply for those McKnight funds. Individual artists are now allowed only one grant at a time. So keep that in mind when you're applying. If you want to apply every year, you don't want there to be overlap of your start and end dates for your projects. An event will be open and accessible to the general public, and any arts and cultural heritage grant is required to have an open to the public event. You must not have any unacceptable or outstanding reports due to ECRAC. If you have questions about whether or not your final reports are outstanding or unacceptable, feel free to reach out to us. You must not have any misuse of funds determination with the Minnesota State Arts Board or other regional arts councils. Okay, before you begin, make sure you're an eligible applicant. Make sure you're applying for an art project. Feel free to assemble a planning team, brainstorm and research and visualize the possibilities of your project. You may call ECRAC and double check whether funds are available. We can talk about your grant project to see which grant application would be a best fit. And make sure that you are submitting your application before the deadline and start date confirmation. Read all grant guidelines and instructions thoroughly, especially the section of what ECRAC cannot fund. If part of your project happens to fall under one of the items that we cannot fund, it will be an ineligible application. Create your online grant portal to begin your application. There is a link to the grant portal on our grant management page as well as the individual grant pages. Once you get to the grant portal, you'll create an account to log into that grant portal, and that will be your login information and can go into your application, save it, come and go in and out of the application as you need as you're working on it. If you have concerns about if you are applying for an art project or what is art or am I an artist, here is a list of what we describe as art. We believe art to be a study of creative skill, the process of using that creative skill, the product of the creative skill, as well as or the audience's experience with the creative skill. The Minnesota State Arts Board and regional arts councils define arts very inclusively. They're activities resulting in the artistic creation or artistic performance of works of the imagination. These activities include the descriptions that follow as defined by the National Endowment for the Arts. So make sure your proposal is for an art project and does fall under the one of the disciplines in the next slide. If we tell you that your project is questionable as an art project, most likely it is. So feel free to give us a call if you have questions about whether your art form falls under one of the art disciplines. This is the list of art disciplines acceptable for applying with our grant programs. As you can see, there are quite a few categories that have been defined by the National Endowment for the Arts. Dance, music, opera, musical theater, theater in general, visual arts, design arts, crafts, photography, media arts, literature, interdisciplinary, folk life arts, humanities, as well as multidisciplinary. If you do not see your art form here on this list, you can reach out to us and we can talk about what your art form is and where it might fit. But if it's not listed here, most likely your project will not be eligible for funding with the Arts Council. Okay, let's get into some grant writing basics. The grant application materials are found at ecrac.org. Make sure all items on the grant application are completed and file uploads are in the correct format when you submit your application. For example, if you're a Mac computer user, the application does not accept Mac files such as Pages. If you're a Mac user, convert your files to a PDF before uploading those documents to the application. Also, if you're a Word user, you can convert them to PDF. The PDF documents work the best in our uploads. Otherwise, Word is also acceptable, and the guidelines will list which acceptable files the application will take. Know your project, how your project fits the grant program criteria in the guidelines. For example, make sure you're an individual artist and that the project benefits you as an artist, not others. It's not meant to teach others. Make sure your application is signed. This is a typed signature for artists, so there will be a spot within the application where you'll type your signature. Grant reviewers can only look at your grant application and they cannot consider additional material that you might mention in your narrative. such as a website. So do not include that information and don't include any extra unasked for items in your proposal. When the grant reviewers are reviewing your application, they have time to read your application previous to the review. And then during the review, they'll look at your work samples and they will discuss your grant narratives as well as the uploads into the application. If you were to include a website, for example, they would not have the opportunity during the review to go to a website to look at that. So any website information you want to make sure you're including in one of the uploads within the application. And then, of course, submit your application on time. You do have until 11:59 p.m. on the deadline date. So if you're applying for a grant on February 1st, you have until 11:59 p.m. on February 1st. Make sure you're including all of the attachment requirements. If you do not upload an attachment, it's possible you will be unable to submit your application if it's required upload section. So when you are going in and out of your application, you don't have to complete the application in one sitting. You can save your application. There's a save button at the bottom of the page. So you can save your application and then log back in later. When you are saving your application and you're exiting, it does give you a list of unanswered questions and things that are still required. So hopefully that's helpful when you are going through the grant process. Okay, here are some very important dates to keep in mind if you're applying for one of our grant programs, especially the start and end dates for your project. You'll hear start and end date information come up a lot, but this is a table that will let you know the dates that are going to be important for you. So the technical assistance deadline date, this is the date that you can reach out to us and you're guaranteed that you will receive a review of your draft before you submit your application. So for example, if you're going to apply on the deadline date of October 1st, you have until September 20th to reach out to us to review your draft, and you'll be guaranteed a review. I encourage you, even if it's after that technical assistance deadline date, to still reach out to us and request a draft review, because most likely we can still help. We just can't guarantee help, especially if it's close to the deadline date. If I have five draft requests to review on the 1st of October, I wouldn't be able to get through all 5 of them. So that's the reason for the technical assistance deadline date. Also, there is a final approved by date. So if you apply, let's say October 1st, you would hear from us before December 31st whether or not you received the grant. So the review will be before then, and you will be invited to the grant review, so you can come listen to the board review your grant application, and then you'll find out that same night of the review if your grant was awarded or not. Otherwise, if you don't attend the review, you do receive a letter from us or a contract that you received the grant or that you didn't. And then the earliest start dates are very important. You want to make sure that your project starts on the earliest start date or after. So if you're applying October 1st, your project cannot begin until January 15th, and it must end before June 30th of the following year. So you have approximately a year to complete your project, or a little more, depending on when you apply. As you see, if you apply February 1st, the earliest start date is May 15th, but that end date is still June 30th of the following year. Same with April 1st deadline date. Start date is July 15th, and the June 30th deadline date of the following year. If you're applying for the ECRAC Individual Artist Mid-Career Grant, the deadlines are February 1st and April 1st, and you want to make sure your project starts the earliest 2 months after the grant deadline date. And then the project must be completed within 14 months of the grant deadline date. So the deadline date of within 14 months of February 1st or within 14 months of April 1st. The Essential Artist Award for Professional Artists, previously known as the ECRAC McKnight Fellowship. This has a deadline date of March 1st, and your project should start on or after May 15th of the year of the deadline, and the project must be completed within 14 months of that grant deadline date as well. The grant amounts available for individual artists include $1,000 for the Arts and Cultural Heritage Individual Artist Grant. This grant includes an outcome evaluation and must have an open to the public component. The ECRAC gallery space is available for your public component if it works for your project. just reach out to ECRAC staff for additional information about that gallery space. We also have a $2,500 grant for the ECRAC Individual Artist Mid-Career Grant and an $8,000 grant for the called the Essential Artist Award. There is no match requirement for any of the individual artist grants. I should note that if you are applying for arts and cultural heritage grants, all of your grant activities do have to take place within the state of Minnesota. That is including any travel. However, if you're applying for McKnight-funded grants, which are the ECRAC Individual Mid-Career Grant and the Essential Artist Award, those grants can fund travel outside the state, so something to keep in mind. When you're writing your grant application, you also want to keep in mind the review criteria that the reviewers will be using to determine the eligibility of your application. So there is a much more detailed description within the grant guidelines for the following items, but if you're applying for the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, the reviewers will be looking at the artistic merit and quality of your project, the organizational ability, community need for the project, as well as equity and inclusion for the underrepresented. If you're applying for McKnight funds, the reviewers will be looking at your artwork samples, the project itself, as well as your artistic resume. So again, if you are wanting more information about each of these items, be sure to reference the grant guidelines. They go into a lot more detail about this, or feel free to give us a call if you have questions about any of these review criteria. But this is exactly what the reviewers will be looking at when they're reviewing your application. Another item that is required for arts and cultural heritage grants is heightened artistic merit. There is further information included in the grant guidelines, but one thing to keep in mind about your application is that it is required for arts and cultural heritage grants and is recommended for the individual artist grants. One way to describe whether your project has the heightened artistic merit is to explain how the project will expand your artistic capacity and how the project will expand your audience's artistic experience. Again, if you have questions, you can reference the grant guidelines or feel free to give us a call. Okay, so let's get into some of the application information. Your application is the first impression that grant reviewers have of your project. So you just want to make sure that you're answering all of the questions that are being asked within the space provided. There are required questions on the application, and those will be marked with an asterisk. If you don't answer one of the required questions and you try to submit your application, it won't allow you to submit your application. So keep track of those required questions with the asterisk and make sure you're answering all of those questions and including all of the uploads that are required. Make sure your project starts after the earliest start date allowable. This includes committing any spending, such as contracting with mentors or purchasing equipment. Make sure your project ends close to the event if you have an event for your project, but with enough time to receive and pay all of your project-related expenses and analyze any outcome data that you are collecting for your project. So the end date and the start date, again, are very important, and you want to make sure there's enough time before and after to complete your project in full. Within the application, there are some narrative sections or questions that require more narrative answer. So what you want to do is make sure in those questions that you are describing what your proposed activities are, what the impact of those activities are going to be, impact to you as an artist, or will they impact your audience. You can research and brainstorm some of those ideas, and that will pay off here. Make sure you're answering all application questions thoroughly so that the reviewers can effectively consider the criteria regarding your project. Remember those criteria requirements that were listed previously. Keep those in mind when you're answering these narrative sections. One of the things you want to think about is how this project is going to impact you as an artist. Where do you want to be once the project's completed? Kind of feel free to tell your story as an artist here. where you are now as an artist, how this project's going to affect you, where do you see yourself as an artist after the project's been completed. Make sure that your narrative tells the same story as your budget. For example, if you're including in your narrative that you're going to be purchasing a piece of equipment for your studio, but your budget doesn't include the purchase of that equipment, the reviewers are probably going to wonder where's the money coming from to purchase this equipment. So make sure you're explaining in your narrative where your funding is going, and then including all of that in the budget as well. If you're applying for the Arts and Cultural Heritage Grant, an outcome evaluation plan is required. So make sure you're including expenses for that outcome evaluation plan. Those expenses could include the printing materials if you're handing out a survey for your project. Note that any equipment purchased for your project can be purchased. However, merely purchasing equipment or materials is not considered a project. What I mean by that is if you're a photographer and you're applying for a photography project and you're going to purchase a new lens for your camera, you must also include a project to go along with that. So you're going to purchase the lens and you plan on shooting in let's say one of the parks within our region, and you're going to complete a photo series of that park. And maybe your photo series will consist of at least 20 photos once you've completed the project. You want to just make sure that there is a project attached to the equipment. If you have questions about that, feel free to let me know. Another thing to keep in mind about an equipment purchase is that if your equipment is going to cost more than $500, you are required to submit 3 separate quotes so that you're doing your due diligence before you make that purchase. So you'll look at 3 separate companies that you can get this piece of equipment from. You don't have to choose the least expensive quote. Just make sure that you're including in your narrative which company you're going to purchase the equipment from and why. And also keep in mind that at the end of your project, you will be reporting on all of these items, especially the financial report. So you're going to be including receipts for your budget, all of your budget items. Okay, here are the allowable expenses and income for your project. So when you're completing your application, you are able to include mentor costs for your project, any workshop costs for your project, transportation, publicity expenses. If you're having an event, you're going to have to publicize that event, rental fees if there are any, supplies and materials, printing and postage. If you're sending out invitations for your event, this is a possibility. If you're ordering supplies or materials, or you're ordering equipment, there's going to be postage for those items. Other things that can be included, perhaps you are needing some insurance for an event space or something similar to that could be listed in other. For income for your project, you can include income from earned income during your project period. So let's say you expect to sell 3 pieces of artwork during your project, and you've priced those pieces at $100 a piece. Your earned income during the project then would be $300. Other grants and contributions could be included if you received grant funds from another foundation that you want to put towards this project. You can include that here. Cash on hand, that's probably the most common thing that we'll see for individual artists is cash on hand. And then of course your grant funds that you'd be receiving from your application if you're awarded the grant. Keep in mind that your project cannot be matched by a Minnesota State Arts Board grant, so you cannot apply for the same project with the Minnesota State Arts Board and the Regional Arts Council. Also, make sure that you're checking your math for your expenses and your income. You want to treat it like a double entry accounting. So your expenses should be the same amount as your income. Keep in mind that we cannot fund for-profit projects. So if your income happens to be higher than your expenses, you would be showing a profit for your project, and it would make the application ineligible. So if you have questions at all about how that works, just give me a call. I can walk you through that. But what you're looking for is to make sure that all of your expenses equal the income for your project. And you don't have to have a match for as an individual artist. So if your expenses are going to be $2,000 and it's just grant funds, $2,000 in grant funds, your income line item for grant requests would be $2,000, and that's all that you would have there. You do not have to, you're not required to put an amount under each line item. You can have all of your expenses fall under mentor costs and all of your income fall under the ECRAC grant request amount. So just as long as those two amounts are equal, your budget will be correct. Again, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. Okay, some other specific items that you are required to include in your application are an artistic resume. This will be an artistic resume for you as an individual artist. And if you're working with a mentor or if you are working with an instructor in a class you'd like to attend, you'll also be required to submit artistic resumes for the mentor and the instructor. Keep in mind that there is a difference between an artistic resume and a work resume. If you are curious about what we're looking for in an artistic resume, I have additional information on the next slide, as well as the grant guidelines also have a detailed summary of an artistic resume and an example, artistic resume if you need one. You are required to include work samples with your application. For example, if you're a visual artist, we will allow up to 10 work samples of photographs of your visual art. If you're a writer, 10 written pages of your work. All of the description is included in the application, so you'll see more details there once you get into the application of what work samples you can include. If you're attending a workshop or a class for your project, you want to make sure you're including that workshop information with the application. So if you go to the website where the description of the workshop is, you can do a screen grab of that website page, or if you're able to print off a description of the workshop or the class, you can scan that and upload it into your application as well. Other supporting material we'll look for are a list of supplies and materials if you're including them in your project. For example, if you're a visual artist and you're going to purchase supplies such as paint, frames, canvases, paintbrushes, we'll want a breakdown of all of those supplies. So you'll want to list out each supply you're going to be purchasing and how much each of those items are going to cost. So maybe you're going to purchase, I'm not sure how much things are, so this is just an example, but let's say you're going to purchase 5 tubes of paint and they're $10 each, so that will be $50. And each of those are going to add up to a total supply cost of $500. So we are looking for that specific breakdown. Another thing you'll want to include in your application is any supporting materials for equipment that you're going to purchase over $500. So as I mentioned before, there is space within the application to upload 3 separate quotes for those equipment purchases over $500. And this is for equipment, if you're purchasing one piece of equipment that's over $500. If you're purchasing, let's say you have 3 smaller pieces of equipment, and each of those is, they're $200 a piece, your total will be $600 for equipment. But each of those items of equipment are less than $500, so you won't need to include quotes. So if there's any questions in your purchasing equipment, if you have questions about the quotes, feel free to give us a call. Just touching back on artistic resumes, if you are building an artistic resume for your application, here are some of the items typically we'll see included on an artistic resume: an artist statement, education or training for your medium. This does not have to be education or training from an art school or a university. It could be as simple as self-taught training. Maybe you've watched videos, or if you've attended classes, or you've worked with a mentor in the past and that's been your artistic training. Just list that information here, and maybe the length of time that you worked with that mentor, things like that. Any employment that you've had as an artist, you can list that as well on your artistic resume. Publications, performances you've participated in, awards or collections that you might be a part of. Some other things you can include would be any presentations maybe that you've given, or residencies you've participated in, commission work that you might have done. Like I said, there is a sample artistic resume within the application, or within the guidelines. And if you have any questions about this, let me know. We do accept up to 2 pages of artistic resumes with the application, but 1 page is also acceptable with the application. Again, if there's questions, just give us a call. A little more detail about the work samples and the description list for your application. Make sure that when you are including your work samples, that you're selecting work samples that the reviewers are going to be looking at artistic excellence as the primary criteria for your work samples. So it's important that the samples you submit represent your work to its best advantage. I would say put your strongest work sample first when you're uploading them into the application. In general, the grant reviewers are not looking for a range of your abilities as an artist. They are looking for a cohesive vision for your grant project. So if you are a multimedia artist, but your project is to work with a mentor to better your painting skills, then most likely you'll want to upload work samples that show your paintings that you've completed in the past. And not maybe another material that you might work with, maybe fiber. It wouldn't make sense to include work samples of your fiber art for a project where you're working with a mentor to improve your painting, if that makes sense. Details on the type of work samples allowed, like I said, are in the application, and they do depend on the art form. Just make sure you're following the sample list instructions in the application and you should be fine. Okay, so you've completed your application and you've hit the submit button. Here's what happens after that deadline date. ECRAC staff becomes monitors of your proposal. This is in order to ensure that your proposal is fundable. Staff are required to inform grant reviewers of any issues surrounding your application if there are any questions found, and we are unable to communicate that to you after the grant deadline date. ECRAC cannot accept any updates or additional information about your application after you've submitted it. So that means if you submit your application and you forgot to upload workshop information, for example, and the deadline date has passed, I can't add any additional information to your application after that date. Keep in mind, though, that let's say you submit your application early, 5 days before the deadline date, for example, and you realize that you forgot to upload something, or you want to change one of your answers, you can reach out to us and I can unsubmit your application if it's early enough. I can unsubmit your application and you can make any of those changes that you wanted to make, and then you can resubmit your application. Just keep in mind that if I unsubmit your application, you do have to resubmit it before the grant deadline date. So again, if there's questions or any concerns about that, you can always reach out to us. Let's see, what else? After the grant deadline date passes, we schedule the grant review date. So you will receive an invitation to attend the grant review once it's been scheduled. So I'll send out an invitation to you and you can attend the grant review if you would like. You're not required to attend the grant review. There is no requirement to do a presentation. That's no longer part of the grant review. But you can attend it and you can hear what the grant reviewers have to say about your project, and you'll hear that same night whether or not your grant was funded. And do remember that the grants are competitive programs, not competitive necessarily against other artists, but competitive against the grant guidelines, and making sure that you have included all of those review criteria that are required in the project. Okay, let's say the grant review is completed and your project was chosen for funding. Congratulations. Once that happens, you receive a contract from us, and we call it the Notification of Grant Award, or NGA, and then you also receive a request for payment, or an RFP. This will need to be signed by you in acceptance of the grant contract. So you have 45 days to sign the NGA and the RFP and mail it back to us. Occasionally, we give you a little less time, but typically it's 45 days that you have to send it back. Once you've signed and submitted your NGA and RFP, you'll receive a grant check from us. We meet with you what we call grant management training, and we talk about what our expectations are at the end of the project, so that hopefully there aren't any surprises once your project has completed and you have to complete a final report. But we give you your grant check, and you're free to do your grant project. And then keep in mind that the grant proposal becomes part of your grant contract with us. So if there happens to be any changes with your project after how do I want to say it? You submit your grant application, and there's a period of time until you hear from us whether you receive the grant, and then there's more time before you can actually start your project. There's always the possibility that there is something that needs to change for the grant project, and the board completely understands that changes might happen. So we do allow grant changes to be submitted to the board for to make requests to change your project. And they're usually requests that might be a change to the workshop dates. Maybe there was a reason that the workshop was canceled and rescheduled for another date, or your event space is no longer available and you need to change the location for your event space, things like that. So obviously this is something that we could talk about further if it comes up. And then another thing after your grant is approved is you do send any of your press releases or advertisements for your event to us so that we can include them on our calendar. And then you're required to include any funding credit lines and logos and use hashtags within any of your promotional materials. So again, this is information that we go into further detail once your grant project has been approved. And we do that grant management training that I mentioned. Okay, in conclusion, we've reached the end. Some things just to keep in mind that I would remind you of is that make sure that you're using the correct grant form when you're applying. We do have multiple different grants available at one time for different deadline dates. So if you want to talk to us about which grant is going to fit your project, you can certainly give us a call. And once you log into the grant portal, make sure you're choosing the correct grant to fill out your application. And you can go in and out of the system to work on your project before the deadline. Feel free to have a friend review your rough draft. I can review your rough draft if there's enough time previous to the project. I'm happy to do that. It doesn't guarantee funding, but it certainly doesn't hurt to have those extra eyes review your rough draft of your application. And then remember your timelines for start and end dates. And in all of that information is in the grant guidelines. Again, I would highly suggest reading through those grant guidelines before you start your application. And if you'd like to review past successful grant applications, they are here and available. I do say probably call before you come in, just to make sure that there isn't something else going on, or that we're here and available to assist you with those grant applications. So you can set up an appointment to review those. If you have any questions about any of the information that I've covered today, feel free to reach out to me via email, or you can give me a call. Or if you want to make an appointment, you can come in and stop by. We can talk one-on-one about a project idea that you might have in mind. I do love talking about project ideas, so feel free to reach out to me. This is our contact information. Keep in mind that we have moved our office from Bram to Hinckley. So we are the East Central Regional Arts Council. We're located at 109 Weber Avenue. Our P.O. Box is 554 in Hinckley, Minnesota. Our phone number is 320-591-7031. I'm at extension 2 if you would like to reach me directly. My email is grantinfo@ecrac.org. Our website is ecrac.org. We have a Facebook page and a Twitter account. We are a small staff here, so you do just want to make sure you give us a call before you stop by, just to make sure that we'll be here and that we are available. Thank you so much for listening to the grant information session. This activity is made possible with funds provided by the McKnight Foundation and also by the voters of Minnesota, thanks to legislative appropriations from both the General Fund and the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. I hope you learned a lot from this presentation, and again, if you have questions, please reach out and give us a call. Thanks again, and good luck with your application.